Charlie McLeod found his brothers in the summer of 1908 on a gravel flat beside the South Nahanni River in the Northwest Territories of Canada, roughly 500 kilometers west of Yellowknife. He had been searching, on and off, for 3 years. Willie and Frank McLeod had gone up the river in 1905 to look for gold, and no letter, no message, no trace of either man had come out of that country since. What Charlie found on the gravel flat was a camp. The blankets were laid out flat, side by side, as if the two men had gone to sleep beside their fire one night and simply never stood up again. Their remains were still lying in those blankets. And according to the account Charlie carried back downriver, an account that eventually reached newspapers from Edmonton all the way to New York, both skeletons were missing their heads. That gravel flat has a name now, and the name is printed on the official maps of Canada. It is called Deadmen Valley. The McLeod brothers were the first documented deaths there, but they were not the last. Over the next 4 decades, along one corridor of river and portage trail no more than 60 miles long, at least 9 more prospectors, trappers, and campers were found dead or were never found at all. Some were burned. Some were frozen. Some stopped existing between one supply run and the next. The men who died on that corridor did not know each other. They arrived in different years from different directions, chasing different things. Some came north from Edmonton. Some drifted east out of the Yukon after the Klondike went quiet. Some were born within 100 miles of the river and had spent their whole lives in that country. The only thing every one of them shared was the trail and the handful of flat, sheltered places along it where a person can pitch a tent. Tonight we are going to walk that corridor together, death by death, in the order it happened. And before we start, I want to flag one thing. There is a detail that repeats across these cases, a small, physical, almost mundane detail, and in 100 years of writing about this valley it almost never gets discussed. I will point to it each time it appears, and near the end of this episode, I will tell you what I believe it means. Here is what this episode covers. First, the complete documented timeline. Every recorded death and disappearance on that stretch of the Nahanni between 1908 and 1945, drawn from Royal Canadian Mounted Police patrol reports and territorial newspaper archives. Second, exactly what Charlie McLeod said he found at his brother's camp, and so. The McLeod brothers. Willie and Frank McLeod grew up at Fort Liard, a Hudson's Bay Company post on the Liard River, sons of a company man, raised in that country and comfortable in it. Their father, Murdoch McLeod, ran the post, which means the boys grew up around trappers, traders, and Denis families, learning the river seasons the way other children learn streets. They spoke the local languages. They knew how to read ice, how to cache meat, how to track a loaded boat up fast water on a line. This point matters because the easiest explanation for a death in the north, that the victim was an outsider who did not know what he was doing, does not apply to them. These were competent, experienced northern men on home ground. Around 1904, the brothers made a first trip into the Nahanni watershed and came out with a story that would pull men into that valley for the next 40 years. The route they took on that first trip, according to the family accounts, was not even up the Nahanni itself. They went in the long way from the Yukon side, working over the divide near the headwaters of the Flat River, which tells you how seriously they took the prospecting, because that approach adds weeks of overland hauling to an already brutal season. They said they had found gold, coarse gold, the kind you can see in the pan, somewhere up the Flat River, a tributary of the Nahanni. According to the family's later accounts, they lost most of what they had recovered when a boat swamped in the rapids on the way out, which on that river is not a dramatic flourish. The Nahanni in the canyons runs deep, fast, and cold, and a moosehide or whipsawed boat loaded with a season's outfit does not forgive a single wrong angle in a standing wave. So in 1905 they went back. This time there were 3 of them. The third man is recorded in different documents as an engineer named Wire, or Wilkinson, depending on the source, a man from outside the territory whom almost nothing is known about. We do not have his first name with certainty. We do not know where he came from or who, if anyone, was waiting for him. Three of them went up the river in the summer of 1905, and none of them came back down. For the first year, nobody worried. Prospectors wintered over all the time, and a man who had found pay gravel had every reason to stay on it and keep his mouth shut. By the second year, the family was asking questions at the posts along the Liard, at Fort Liard and Fort Simpson, and getting nothing back because nothing had come down the river. Understand what silence means in that country in 1906. There is no telegraph up the Nahanni, no patrol schedule, no one whose job it is to notice an absence. Information travels at the speed of a canoe, and only in summer. By 1908, Charlie McLeod had organized a search and taken it up the Nahanni himself through the canyons to the wide timbered valley between the first and second canyon where travelers naturally stop to camp. That is where he found them. Now, here is what the record actually supports, and here is where it frays. Every version agrees on the core: 2 skeletons, in camp by the remains of a fire, positioned in or beside their bedding. The famous detail, the missing heads, comes from Charlie's account, and it hardened over time. In the earliest tellings, the remains were scattered and incomplete, which after 3 years in open country is unremarkable. In the later tellings, the skeletons lay neatly in their blankets and both skulls were gone, and one version added that a hand was stretched toward a rifle. Some late accounts added a note carved or scrawled somewhere in camp, words to the effect that the brothers had found a fine prospect, and no such note survives in any file. That is how this story grew for a century, a physical detail added here, a dramatic gesture there, each retelling a little cleaner and a little darker than the one before. The third man, Weir or Wilkinson, was never found at all. Not that year, not ever, and no one has ever established whether he died with the brothers or walked away from them, and that unresolved third man is the hinge every murder theory has swung on since. There was no coroner within hundreds of miles. No cause of death was ever determined. Charlie buried what he found. The valley got its name, Deadmen Valley. The newspapers got their headline, and the file, such as it was, closed. And I am opening with the McLeods, not because their case is the strangest on this trail, but because their case set the template, a camp in the same corridor, a fire that had gone out, remains that raised more questions than they answered. Watch how many times that template repeats. To understand why it repeats, you have to understand what this trail actually is, because the geography is not background here. The geography is a suspect. The South Nahanni cuts through the Mackenzie Mountains in a series of 4 canyons, numbered from the bottom up, with walls that in places rise close to 4,000 feet, taller than the walls of the Grand Canyon. First Canyon, the lowest and the deepest, runs for miles as a limestone slot where the shoreline shrinks in places to nothing at all. Upstream of the canyons stands Virginia Falls, a curtain of water about 96 meters high, roughly twice the height of Niagara, split down the middle by a pillar of rock, and the sound of it carries for miles down the valley. A traveler going up that river in the early 20th century had exactly one way through: track the boat up the canyons, and tracking means a man on shore, waist deep where the shore fails, hauling a loaded boat against a current running several meters a second on a line, for days, and camping wherever the walls happened to relent. And the walls relent in only a handful of places. Deadmen Valley is the largest of them, a wide forested basin between First Canyon and Second Canyon, with game, timber, flat ground, and shelter from the wind that funnels down the slots. Every single person who traveled that river camped there, because there was almost nowhere else to camp. That is the first mechanism to hold in your mind. This is not a case of victims scattered across a wilderness. This is a funnel. And the funnel has a second-order effect that matters even more than the first, because everyone camped in the same few places. Deaths that would have been scattered invisibly across 10,000 square miles of ordinary wilderness were instead concentrated, found, and counted on one short trail. The land itself marched every traveler year after year onto the same few gravel flats, and then sealed them off from help behind canyon walls and hundreds of miles of empty country. Nahanni Butte, the nearest settlement at the river's mouth, was days away downstream in summer and effectively unreachable in the cold months, when the river ice in the canyons piles and shears and cannot be trusted to walk on. The second mechanism is heat, which sounds impossible for the subarctic, and that is exactly why it mattered. The lower Nahanni has hot springs, the largest of them at what is now called Krause Hot Springs, below First Canyon, where sulfurous water comes out of the ground warm enough to bathe in year-round, and around them pockets of ground stay soft and green, far later into the year than the surrounding country. Wild vegetation grows there that grows nowhere else at that latitude. A trapper named Gus Krause later lived at those springs for decades with his wife Mary, comfortably, which tells you the warmth is real. Out of those real pockets grew an unreal rumor repeated in southern newspapers for decades of a hidden tropical valley in the far north, warm, lush, and stuffed with gold, sometimes embroidered with mist, palm ferns, and lost civilizations, depending on the editor. The rumor was false, but it did real work, and here is the mechanism. It pulled men in small numbers steadily for 40 years, and it pulled them in undersupplied, because a man heading for a warm valley packs differently than a man heading into the coldest country on the continent, a country where winter temperatures sit for weeks at -40 and touch -50, where the difference between the right outfit and the almost right outfit is not comfort but survival. The legend did not just describe the valley, it shaped who arrived and how prepared they were, and therefore who died. And there is a third layer, older than either. The Dene people of the lower river, in whose language the river is Naha-Dahe, told of the Naha, a mountain-dwelling people who in earlier generations came down out of exactly this high country to raid the lowland camps, and who then, according to the oral history, vanished abruptly and completely, with no battle and no explanation remembered. The Dene did not treat the upper canyons as a casual place, and their travel patterns show it. Names later attached to the map tell you what the country came to mean: the Funeral Range, the Broken Skull River, the Headless Range, an entire geography annotated with warning. When the McLeod story came out in 1908, it did not land in a vacuum. It landed in a valley that already had a reputation, and the reputation and the deaths began feeding each other from that day forward. Willie and Frank McLeod camped where everyone camped, in the funnel, below the warm springs, in the shadow of the Naha story. So did every man who came after them. Keep the funnel in mind as we walk through what happened next, because every case you are about to hear happened inside it. The next name in the record is Martin Jorgensen. He went up the Nahanni around 1913, a seasoned prospector working the flat river country exactly where the McLeods claimed their gold. And Jorgensen is the one case in this cluster with something close to a message from inside. At some point, he got a note carried out to a partner downriver, and the note, as it was later described, said that he had found gold and that his partner should come up and join him. Think about what that note is. It is the only document in this entire file written by one of the dead while he was still alive, still working, still optimistic, and it is a document that says, "Come here." By the time anyone acted on it, years had slid by, the way they do in country where a round trip can eat a season, and a man with a good claim has every reason to stay quiet on it. When searchers finally reached Jorgensen's camp near the mouth of the Flat River around 1917, and the search party by most accounts included the trader Poole Field, a man who ran the post at Nahanni Butte and knew this river as well as anyone alive, his cabin was gone, burned flat, down to the sill logs. His skeleton lay outside it, some distance from the ruin in the open. The legend, of course, says the skull was missing, and by that point the legend said that about everyone. What the Soper record supports is this: a capable man, a burned cabin, remains outside in the open, no gold recovered, no rifle or valuables inventoried in any surviving report, no cause of death established, and a note promising riches that no one ever found. And notice the geometry of the scene, because it will repeat. He was outside the cabin. Whatever happened, it either drove him out of shelter or caught him already out of it, in a country where being outside shelter in winter without fire is a sentence with a short clock. Mark the detail. His fire did not just go out. His fire took the cabin with it. The second case is a trapper named John O'Brien, and his is the one that unsettles me most, precisely because there is nothing legendary about it. In the early 1920s, O'Brien was running a trapline in the Nahanni country with a partner, and a trapline partnership works on rhythm, each man running his stretch of line, both returning to a shared cabin on a schedule, so an absence announces itself within days, not years. When O'Brien failed to turn up, the partner went looking. He found O'Brien on a ridge, kneeling by his campfire, frozen solid. The fire was laid, kindlings stacked and ready, the whole structure built correctly by a man who had built 1,000 of them. In his hands, by the account that came out with the searchers, was a bunch of matches. He had everything he needed to live, and he died in the act of using it, at the exact instant before warmth. Hold that image, because I am going to come back to it with an explanation that makes it worse, not better. No animal, no attacker, no mystery of evidence, and yet the scene reads like the country stopping a man's clock out of pure spite. Mark the detail again. A fire, present, prepared, and never lit. The third case is a pair, Bill Epler and Joe Mulholland in 1936. By now the pattern was known. The valley had its dark name, and these two were not naive about it. They were experienced northern men who had trapped and prospected the area for years, who knew the McLeod story and the Jorgensen story and went in anyway, because experienced men always believe the file is about other people. They went in to winter near Glacier Lake, in the headwater country above the falls, about as deep into the watershed as a man could put himself. In the spring, they were simply gone. A pilot passing over reported their cabin burned, and by the 1930s there were finally aircraft in that country, which means for the first time a search could cover in hours what Charlie McLeod had needed seasons to cover. It did not matter. Searchers found no remains at all, not that year, not since. 2 more names, 1 more burned cabin, and this time not even bones to argue over. And around these 3 cases, the smaller entries stack up in the record like snow against a wall. Phil Powers, prospector, found in 1932 as charred remains in the ruins of his own burned cabin on the Flat River, discovered by an RCMP patrol that had come specifically because he was overdue, with the patrol report noting, in the flat language of a man writing with cold hands, that there was no way to determine what had happened. And one persistent version of the story claims his name was found written near the ruin, as if in farewell, a detail the file does not confirm. A wandering figure the papers called the Yukon fisher wanted by police who had lived outside the law in the bush for years, whose bones were reported found near Bennett Creek. Annie Lafferty, the only woman in this file, lost in the bush in 1926 after leaving a party traveling overland, searched for, glimpsed once by a searcher in an account that grew stranger with every retelling, never recovered. And in 1945, a miner from Ontario found dead in his sleeping bag in the valley, with newspaper accounts, and I stress that these are newspaper accounts, claiming injuries to the head and neck that the file never confirmed, and claiming his supplies were untouched beside him, which if true rules out starvation and very little else. By the end of the 1940s, the popular tally of the dead and missing on this one corridor stood anywhere from 10, which the record supports, to more than 40, which it does not, because by then, any death within 200 miles was being quietly filed under the famous name. 10 is enough. 10 documented cases, 160-mile funnel, and not one of them ever closed with a cause. So let us do what the RCMP never had the resources to do from a patrol canoe, and take the explanations one at a time. There are 5 that have been seriously offered, and each one covers some of the deaths, and each one fails somewhere. Explanation 1. Murder for gold. This is the oldest theory and the most human one, and it has real economics behind it. The Klondike Rush of 1898 had ended just years before the McLeods went in, and the North was full of men who had dubbed for 2 seasons and come out with nothing, men for whom a rumor of coarse gold on an unpolished river was worth a great deal. The McLeods reportedly carried samples out in 1904 and went back for more. Jorgensen wrote that he had struck it, and his gold was never found. The third man, Weir or Wilkinson, vanished from a camp where explanation 2, the Naha, or some hidden hostile group surviving in the high country. This is the version the pulp writers loved, and I want to handle it carefully because the Naha are not a monster story. They are part of Dene oral history, and that history itself says the Naha disappeared generations before Willie McLeod was born, a specific remembered event, not a lingering presence. No expedition, no patrol, no aerial survey, and eventually no national park inventory across thousands of square miles ever found evidence of an unknown group living in those mountains. No structures, no caches, no trails, no fires, and a human population, even a small one, cannot exist for 40 years without leaving any of those things. Treating a real people's remembered history as the Valley's boogeyman says more about the newspapers of 1947 than it does about the evidence. Explanation 3. Animals, and this is where the famous heads finally get an honest answer. Every body in this cluster lay exposed for months or years before anyone found it, the McLeods, for 3 winters. Bears, wolves, and wolverines scavenge remains, and forensic taphonomy, the study of what happens to bodies after death, has documented the sequence in detail. Scavengers disarticulate a skeleton in a roughly predictable order, and the skull is among the first parts detached and carried away. Because once the connecting tissue is gone, it separates easily, and a wolverine, an animal with jaw strength enough to crack frozen bone, will carry a skull a long way to work on it. Search the ground within a few hundred meters, and you might find it. Charlie McLeod, arriving after 3 years, grieving in dangerous country, did not conduct a grid search. Police at the time understood all of this perfectly and said so in their reports. A skeleton found after 3 winters with its skull missing is not evidence of a decapitation. It is evidence of 3 winters. That is the resolution of the first open loop I planted at the start. And notice what it does. It quietly removes the single most sensational fact in the whole legend. The fact that named the valley and the range and sold 40 years of newspapers, and leaves the deaths themselves exactly as unexplained as before. The heads were never the mystery. The mystery is that anyone died at all, in camp again and again in the same place. Explanation 4. The country itself, drowning in the canyons, where the river runs fast enough that the McLeods had already lost 1 cargo of gold to it, and where cold water adds its own mechanism because researchers like Gordon Giesbrecht, who has spent a career studying cold water immersion, have shown that the first minute in near freezing water triggers an involuntary gasp reflex that can drown a strong swimmer before cold ever touches his core. Starvation in a valley whose game can vanish for a season, because northern hare and lynx populations crash on roughly a 10-year cycle and take a trapper's winter food web down with them. And cold, which does not kill the way people imagine. Advanced hypothermia degrades the brain before it stops the heart. As core temperature falls through the low 30s Celsius, judgment goes first, then fine motor control, and a match is a fine motor task. And people in the final stages are documented doing profoundly irrational things. A 1995 forensic study by Marcus Rothschild and Volkmar Schneider found that in roughly a quarter of fatal hypothermia cases, the victims had undressed as they died, a documented phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, caused by misfiring nerves flooding the brain with a sensation of heat. Cold does not just kill you. It first convinces you that you are fine, then takes your hands, then lies to you about being warm. A man kneeling at a laid fire with matches in his hand and no fire lit is not a strange scene to anyone who has read the case files. He built the fire while his hands still worked, and his judgment already did not, or the reverse, and either way the last few degrees took the strike of the match away from him. It may be the most textbook scene in this entire episode. Explanation 5. The legend itself. In February 1947, a young reporter named Pierre Bertoun, 26 years old, later one of Canada's most famous historians, was flown into the valley for the Vancouver Sun with the bush pilot Russ Baker in winter, looking for the tropical valley of headless men. He found snow, silence, and no horror at all, and the story of the search still ran around the world, picked up by wire services on multiple continents, because Headless Valley was a name that sold papers whether or not anything was in it. That is the mechanism to understand. The legend had become self-sustaining, generating coverage from its own absence of evidence. Over the years, the tally inflated. Deaths from elsewhere migrated into the valley's column. Every burned cabin in the territory drifted toward the famous name, and the name did the counting. Where this explanation breaks down is the floor. Strip away every exaggeration. Audit the file with the coldest eye you can manage, and the strictest reading of the record still leaves a real cluster of real men, dead on one short trail, without a single established cause among them. The legend inflated the number. It did not invent the bodies, which brings us to the one man who ran the experiment. In 1927, a young Englishman named Raymond Patterson, an Oxford graduate who had walked away from a bank job in London, went up the Nahanni alone, tracking his canoe through the canyons the McLeods had died beyond, and on that river he crossed paths with Albert Fela, a prospector who would go on making solo trips up the Nahanni into his 70s, and whose long survival is its own quiet data point, because it proves the country was survivable by a careful man with margin. The following year, Patterson came back with a partner named Gordon Matthews and deliberately wintered near Deadmen Valley, in the heart of the corridor, in the season that kills. His journals became the book The Dangerous River, and what they record is, in one sense, nothing. No stalker, no hidden people, no menace in the dark, two men and their dogs running trap lines out of a warm cabin through an ordinary, brutal winter. What they record instead is margin, or the lack of it, ice that nearly took him, rapids that nearly took his outfit, a near miss on thin ice with the temperature far below zero, where wet clothes and distance from the cabin would have finished him within the hour. Cold snaps near -50 where the difference between an ordinary evening and a fatal one was the stove staying lit. Patterson came out convinced the valley needed no monster, and his account carries a weight no theory does, because he is the only writer in this entire file who paid for his opinion with a winter. And his winter throws light on the detail I promised you at the start. Go back through every case tonight. The McLeods, dead beside a fire that had gone out. Jorgensen, Powers, Epler and Mulholland, cabins burned around or over them. O'Brien, dead at a fire never lit. In every documented death on this trail, fire is present and fire is wrong, out, unlit or loose, and fire in that country is not one risk but three. On the Nahanni in winter, fire's the entire boundary between camping and dying. So a fire that fails at -40 starts a countdown measured in hours. A stove fire in a small, tinder-dry spruce cabin is also the thing most likely to burn that cabin down around you in minutes, faster than a sleeping man can wake and react. And a man who escapes a burning cabin at -40 in whatever he sleeps in has traded a fast death for a slow one, which may be exactly what Jorgensen's skeleton outside his ruined cabin is telling us. And a stove drawing badly in a sealed cabin produces carbon monoxide, a gas that binds to hemoglobin roughly 200 times more readily than oxygen does, and that kills sleeping men without waking them, leaving them exactly as the McLeods were found, lying peacefully in their blankets beside a dead fire. The something that was killing campers on the same trail may simply be the moment the fire fails in any of its three ways, repeated, decade after decade, in the one valley where everyone had to camp and no one could call for help. That is an interpretation, not a finding, and I offer it as exactly that. I want to end with the men rather than the mystery. Willie and Frank McLeod had a brother who spent 3 years refusing to let them stay lost and who brought them out of that valley and buried them. Martin Jorgensen had a partner waiting on a note that promised good news. Epler and Mulholland had people who sent planes over Glacier Lake looking for smoke.